A Comparison of the Effects of Cyberbullying on College Students of Different Cultures by Megan Hernandez. Cyberbullying is not often spoken about in college-age students, at least not as much as it should, and this does not mean that it is not still a very prevalent issue. The question that we will be looking at specifically in this PowerPoint is, does this prevalence change depending upon the cultural setting? The studies that we'll be looking at are two studies done in the United States on weird populations, weird being Western, college-educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. A study done on a university in Qatar, a study done on a university in Spain, and a study done on a university in Kenya. And my hope with these 5 studies that we will be looking at will be able to bring to light whether or not a weird population is able to cover essentially all of the bases for even understudied populations. The first study that we'll be looking at is a United States study that was done on a rather large Midwest university. This is one of our studies in this PowerPoint that is considered a weird population, which I mentioned previously is a Western, college-educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. These populations are what is genuinely widely considered the norm for psychological studies, just because almost all of the studies that are in circulation that are widely used are done on these populations just because they're more readily available than doing a study on, let's say, compared to our Qatar study or our Kenyan study that we're going to be taking a look at. So this study was completed by Mary Varghese and Carol Pistol in 2017, and they completed it on 338 students ranging from the ages of 18 to 26. In this study, there was actually 52.1% of women and 47.6% men, so there was a female majority in this study. The tool that they utilized was the 35-item cyberbullying and online aggression instrument by Hinduja and Patchin. I'm sorry if I'm butchering those names, but this tool not only measured the occurrence, but also the involvement, which means whether or not they were the victim or the bully. So it measured not only if they were getting cyberbullied, but also if they were the bullies themselves. And what they actually found was 15.1% of college students admitted to being victims of cyberbullying, and 8% of college students admitted to being the cyberbullies themselves. And additionally to that, females seemed to be the primary victims in this study. So females were seen to being more likely to be victims of cyberbullying than men. The next study that we'll look at is another study done in the United States, and this is another one of our weird population studies. This study, however, was completed by Carlos Zalaqueta and Sirashia Chatters, and this one was done at another rather large southeastern university. This one was done on 613 students ranging between the ages of 21 to 27. It again had another female majority with 25.1% of students being male and a whopping 74.9% of students being female that were involved in this study. And the tool that they utilized was the college cyberbullying survey that they actually created themselves for this study. And it consisted of 23 questions that were specifically developed for this study. And it contained 2 sections, one on just basic demographics of the students themselves, and the other one a 14-question section on cyberbullying experiences, so whether or not they were the victims or the bullies themselves and how the cyberbullying occurred. And what the study discovered was that 19% of students experienced cyberbullying during college, and 5% of those students who were cyberbullied actually became the cyberbullies themselves. The next study that we'll be looking at is our first understudied population study that is in this PowerPoint, which is our Qatar study. This study was completed by Al Rajay and Company. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And it was done on 836 students at a Qatar university, and they ranged from the ages of 18 to 34 years old. In this study, it had another majority of female, with 18.5% of students being male and a whopping 81.5% of students being female. And the tool that they used was the Revised Cyberbullying Inventory Questionnaire 2 by Topaku and Erder Baker, created in 2017. And this questionnaire contained 10 questions that the students had to answer twice, one time for if they had bullied someone and one time for if the bullying had been done to them, when it is another self-report survey. And the questionnaire showed that 35.8% of students reported being victims of cyberbullying, and 6.8% of students reported actually being the bullies themselves. And out of all of the women and men, 33.5% of women reported being cyberbullied, and 45.8% of men reported being cyberbullying. So in this study, it is actually seen that males were being more, or seemingly being more targeted with the cyberbullying than females. The next understudied population that we'll look at is a Spanish study. This study was completed by Caravaca Sanchez and Company in 2016. It was done on 543 students from the University of Murcia in Spain, and the students ranged in age from 17 to 29 years old. Their methodology was another self-report survey, but this one of their own creation, and it was given in a classroom setting by 3 interviewers who each had a roughly 5 hours of training on how to administer the survey. And what they found in the survey was that 52.7% of college students reporting being victims of cyberbullying, and this survey did not, unfortunately, have the portion that showed how many of students reported being bullies themselves. And of the students who experienced cyberbullying, however, 54.6% were females, so it does show another prevalence of females being more likely to be cyberbullied than males. The last study that we will look at is the Kenyan study, which is our last understudied population. It was completed by Nadij, Okello, and Wamu in 2020, and it was done on 396 students at a private university in Nairobi, Kenya. The students at this university were between the age of 16 to 25, and 49.7% were females and 50.3% were males, so it did have a majority of males, which is the only study in this PowerPoint that had a majority of males. The rest have a majority of females. And this tool that was utilized was a 21 question scale addressing victimization and a 20 question scale addressing public humiliation, malice, deception, and unwanted contact. This scale or survey, more like it, was created by Don, Kelly, Chiang, and Padilla in 2013, and that was the tool that they utilized in this study. And what they were able to find was that 75.8% of college students reported that they were victims of cyberbullying, and a whopping 49.7% of college students reported that they were cyberbullying victims themselves. So this study definitely is a lot bigger numbers than we could see with the rest of the studies, which I just think is extremely interesting. And furthermore, in this study, it was also found that men were more likely to be cyberbullies than women, which I think is extremely interesting. Now we are just going to look at some cross-cultural similarities and differences that can be seen as we look at a comparison of these studies. So the first one that we're going to look at is women were the majority in the survey population, with the outlier being the Kenya study, which we can see that In the first U.S. study, 52.1% were women. In the second U.S. study, 74.9% were women. In the Qatar study, 81.5% were women. In the Spain study, 74.6% were women. And in the Kenya study, 49.7% were women. So Kenya was that outlier with more males than females. The next similarity and difference that we'll be looking at is that all of the studies done on understudied populations had a much higher rate of cyberbullying. As we can see, the two studies done on the weird populations that we've spoken of previously were the two U.S. studies, and their rates of self-reported cyberbullying were 15.1% and 19.0%. When compared to the three understudied populations, which were the Qatar, the Spain, and the Kenya studies, you could see that there's a rather wide range that is much higher than the weird populations, with the Qatar study having 35.8% of reported cyberbullying, the Spain study having 52.7% of reported cyberbullying, and the Kenya study having a whopping 75.8% of cyberbullying self-reported. The conclusion that I have come to is that when comparing weird studied populations, which are considered the norm for psychological studies, to understudied populations, they fall extremely short in being able to provide an accurate picture. This is extremely concerning due to the fact that if other studies followed the same trends as these do, then anyone who don't fall into these weird categories, which is Western, college-educated, industrial, rich, democratic, then they would not be able to apply the information used in these studies to themselves accurately. They would not be applicable at all.